Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Thank you so much for joining us. It is the start of the day here in DC. Of course, it's a very late evening in Manila, and so I really appreciate our two guests, our two panelists joining us today. Before we turn over the floor to them, let me do some brief housekeeping. As many might know, I'm Greg Bolin. I direct the Southeast Asia Program here at CSIS in Washington. And today's event on the 2022 Philippine elections and the U.S. alliance is going to be on the record. Everything that you see here will be available later on CSIS.org and on YouTube, and you are more than welcome to make use of it as you will. The event is made possible by general support to CSIS. And when we get to audience Q&A a little bit later in the event, I'd ask that you please use the Q&A function on Zoom, and I'll go ahead and pull out questions and read them to our panelists. Now, by way of introduction, I'm sure as all of you who logged in are aware, there's a presidential election, national elections, coming up in the Philippines next year. And I think that this webinar is particularly well timed, given that even though the deadline for filing candidacies in the Philippines was a month ago, the real deadline was 2 days ago on November 15th, when candidates, well, parties had to substitute in any new candidates if they chose to do so. This is the same way that Rodrigo Duterte, the current president, famously made an 11th hour entry into the last Philippine elections at late 2015. And expectedly, we saw last minute drama in Manila 2 days ago. So the slate, of course, there are a whole lot of presidential aspirants right now. The big names are currently Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Bongbong Marcos, leading the latest polls. Then we have Vice President Lenny Robredo, boxing superstar and Senator Manny Pacquiao, current Manila Mayor Isko Moreno, and the last minute entry of Senator Bongo, who was previously, until the 15th, running for vice president. And then on the vice presidential ticket, we have the somewhat surprising entry of Sara Duterte, current president's daughter, and the mayor of Davao, who was leading all the early presidential polls, but has decided to run in de facto coalition with Bongbong Marcos. We also have her trailing, currently Tito Soto, the current leader of the Senate. And so it's shaping up to be an exciting election season in the Philippines, and for the U.S., an exciting time and perhaps a difficult time to manage the relationship with its oldest treaty ally in the Pacific. But with that, let me shut up and turn the floor over to our real experts. The first that we're going to hear from is Dr. Aries Arugay. Aries is a visiting fellow with the ISEAS-Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, and a professor of political science at University of the Philippines Diliman. He was also recently named a fellow with Social Weather Stations in the Philippines, the leading polling outfit in the Philippines, and is editor-in-chief of the Asian Politics and Policy Journal. Aries, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Greg. Good morning to our friends and colleagues in the United States, and magandang gabi sa mga kababayan ko sa Pilipinas. It's a pleasure to be invited again to a CSIS event. The official campaign season hasn't started. It won't start until February of next year. But the heat from the 2022 elections could already be felt throughout the entire archipelago. My preliminary remarks will be concentrated on three things. The first is what I describe is a looming formation of a cartel of dynasties that is led by this seemingly solid Marcos Jr. Sara Duterte alliance. And I particularly observe this as an interesting development in the nature of Philippine electoral politics, because back then, for decades, the Philippines has always been ruled by dynasties. Historian Al McCoy wrote or edited a volume entitled The Anarchy of Families to aptly describe Philippine politics, both in the past and the present. However, it seems like dynasties are learning. They're learning that the electoral exercise in the Philippines could not simply be some form of a wild, wild west competitive zero-sum winner-take-all that somehow punishes the losers of preceding electoral cycles. I borrow the concept of a dynasty cartel mainly from Dan Slater's idea of a party cartel that was formed in some Southeast Asian regimes, particularly in Indonesia. But unlike in other countries in the region, parties don't really matter in the Philippines back then. And surely in this electoral cycle, parties do not matter. In fact, none of the major presidential candidates that Greg mentioned come from major parties that are still living. Parties tend to die and then get resurrected, whoever wins the presidential race. This means that what you have in place are political families that are not simply driven by the logic of competition anymore, but the possible logic of collusion. And what you have is the perfect conditions, I think, for this collusion, because we're not just talking about the patriarchs or the leading lights of the dynasties who are running. We're talking about second generation dynasts. We're talking about offsprings, or if you want to be more on the negative side, the spawn of former presidents who are now forming the most solid and possibly the formidable tandem to be. And I'm referring to Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte. So what does this seeming cartelization of dynasties mean? It seems that Philippine politics might not have, if this cartel that I'm envisioning will come true, then competition in the Philippines will not be as rabid as before. And therefore, you won't necessarily have those cycles wherein changes in leadership might require changes a lot in policy. However, having a cartel formed by these two offsprings of these former presidents who are both not only dictatorial but populist authoritarian will spell the end, I think, of Philippine democracy as it is, or at least liberal democracy. My second point has something to do with the fact that what is at stake is the future of not only of the Duterte administration or the coalition, but also Duterte himself personally. And just like before, a lot of presidents, when they go and finish their term, their interest has something to do with their survival after they serve their term. We've had Philippine presidents who were incarcerated and were charged after the end of their term. And the looming ICC prosecution, as well as other cases that might be filed domestically, means that the stakes for President Duterte are high with this election. And this is why a lot of other analysts who seem to challenge my idea of this dynasty cartel is saying that the mere fact that Bongo was asked to run for the presidency means that the big tent of the pro-Duterte coalition is not all united. That might be the case, but it also points that Sara Duterte herself is not simply a carbon copy of President Duterte. That Sara Duterte has her own ideas. While, of course, Sara Duterte will protect the interest of her father, that doesn't necessarily extend to the other members of the Duterte administration. And particularly the members of the administration party, who Sara Duterte today revealed that they have asked for support, meaning her and Bongbong Marcos, but PDP Laban refused to support their tandem. So this means that it's not all good within the big tent of the pro-Duterte coalition. And that leads me to my third point before we go to other Q&A. I'll leave the discussion on social media and disinformation with the expert Camille. But I could also chip in with what I think the role of social media will be in the coming election, and as well as digital disinformation. My last point has something to do with, given that the likely outcome would be that the administration will be split between those who will support Bongbong Marcos and those who will support Bongo, who is the considered anointed candidate of President Duterte, this gives a chance for other candidates. This means that with a split vote of this solid administration coalition, it means that given the plurality system of presidential elections, meaning you don't need a majority of all votes, you only need to have the most votes, there could be a chance for a strong anti-Duterte opposition candidate to maybe maneuver himself or herself and win a plurality. But that depends on to what extent the dichotomization of the Duterte coalition will prevail in the coming months. But it seems that President Duterte himself doesn't trust Marcos Jr. He doesn't want Marcos Jr. to be president. He wants his own former chief aide, Bongo. And this only means that President Duterte is not so sure. And this is why, as a last-ditch, last-minute resort, he is running for the Senate. The first time that an outgoing president will run for supposedly an inferior post. Greg, I'll end there and let Camille give her remarks, but I think there'll be a lot of questions and discussion that will follow soon.
Thank you, Aries. So next, I'd like to turn the floor over to Camille Elemia. Camille is a freelance journalist with over 10 years of experience in political and international reporting. She was previously a senior reporter for Rappler and a TV news reporter for CNN Philippines, where her work has covered media, disinformation, migration, and democracy. Camille?
Hi, good evening to everyone. Well, good morning to those in the US and magandang gabi sa mga nandito sa Pilipinas. Let me just share my screen. My presentation will focus on three things: the social media and the social media relations with campaigns, political campaigns in 2016, and then what we found out after 2019, the senatorial elections, and of course, what we can expect or what are the lessons that we can learn now so as not to prevent whatever happened in the past, and also some challenges that we're still facing. But before that, I'd like to put into context what I'm going to say, because this is not like, while we are talking about disinformation, I'd like to show the context for us to understand why disinformation is all the more a pressing problem now. I mean, it has always been a problem, but because of the current media situation and the pandemic, it has become extra difficult for us, or it will become more challenging. So first, of course, is the closure of ABS-CBN. It is the Philippines' largest broadcaster, and it has the widest network in the archipelago. And of course, the attacks against the free press. So that's Rappler, Inquirer, and of course, ABS-CBN, and also even the alternative media organizations. Like this one is IC Salem, a news executive or a news editor of a progressive and an alternative news organization. And of course, the pandemic has forced many news organizations in the country, especially in the provinces, to shut down because of the lack of resources. And of course, it's the closure of ABS-CBN, which is the widest network, and then the closure of community papers, and like because of the problems in the provinces, it's easier for them, because the reality is community journalists face greater risk in their daily jobs because of their because of their nearness to politicians, and their lives are more at stake. So what's happening now is, with all these context, it's dangerous for them to report that. It's far more dangerous for them to report the truth now than before, and people are left with limited options on accessing information. And all these are happening in the context of the anti-terror law, which many critics say will be used by the government or anyone, like any powerful person, to run after a perceived enemy or a perceived critic. And that's the brief context I'd like to talk about. And all these are happening in the backdrop of social media. So pre-2016, of course, it's social media has been in existence, Facebook has been in existence, but it only played a small role in national campaigns. It's more of like a by the way for politicians. It's like, okay, we recognize that social media exists, but we won't exert so much effort to tap into the people there. It's more of like, at least they're covering that base, but they're not exerting so much effort. And they also feel like it will not really translate votes. Social media users for them will not be converted to actual votes. But then what happened was 2016 happened, or 2015 happened, because we all know President Duterte was the first presidential candidate, or the first national candidate to win an elections with an organic social media base. I'm saying organic because at that time, that's what it felt, that's how it felt. And at the same time, we actually saw people actually supporting him. And this would translate to real numbers in sorties, in campaign events, and all that. It's not just all the trolls, all the bots, and all that. We knew it after the fact. But definitely, there are real people that supported President Duterte, especially with the way they handled their social media campaign. Back in 2016, when President Duterte just won, Nick Gabunada, the social media handler of the Duterte campaign, said this was his claim. They only had a 10 million budget, and because they had limited budget, they had to be creative. That was his word. So they tapped into volunteers. They tapped into actual people. Like, they divided into 4 groups: Luzon, Visayas, Mindanao, and the OFWs. So that's what happened. But back then, what happened was there was a proliferation of the use of bots. It was like public relations on steroids. That's what I call it. But public relations isn't necessarily bad, but what made it bad is the hate speech. It started then. The fake news, the false information, it also started then. I remember there was a school event wherein 2 students asked critical questions to President Duterte, and the social media army of President Duterte swarmed these students. They created fake information about them, so they put the lives of these students in danger. And that was just the start of what the Philippines will experience 5 to 6 years after. And like I said earlier, there was really mobilization of social media users. This was at the start of the campaign of President Duterte. You wouldn't feel it. But later on, because what they did was they invested months before the campaign, they invested so much hype in the candidacy, and then the social media, and parallel is the social media effort. So at the end of the campaign, I remember there were millions of Filipinos, I think more than 1 million Filipinos in Luneta. I don't know if Aries would remember that, but that was that was the biggest campaign sortie. Now we move on to 2019, the midterm elections. Rappler, I was a previous Rappler reporter, and I was covering disinformation and democracy there. Rappler had a study on social media in the 2019 election. So basically what we found out was these are the things that we already know, but we finally found evidence, we finally found proof, and we finally saw the networks that, number one, candidates would use multiple support pages and groups. These are not necessarily under the name of these candidates. This is so as to make it appear that they have strong social media presence. So sometimes there are candidates, I clearly remember, like, for example, the name is totally not related to politics or to that person, but when you try to dig deeper, when you dissect the content, they are really pushing for a certain candidate. So that's one of their strategies. And clearly between these official pages and the so-called support pages, there is a coordinated behavior, wherein posts from the official pages would be amplified by the support pages. And then sometimes they would also share the same websites. And these websites are also a source of disinformation, because what happens in a disinformation network is there's a website, and then that website will be amplified in different social media pages, which are public, social media groups, which can also be public or private, and by influencers. So that's what that's basically how that works. And this is really important because we are seeing this until now, and this will be very important in next year's elections. Non-political channels, those that push entertainment, memes, and other funny content are being used for politics. In fact, there have been incidents when several K-pop or several fan pages are suddenly, after gaining so many followers, they would then change their name to a politician's name, and then they would use it and make it appear like there's a really huge following, and then you unknowingly, you're a fan of that page or you're a fan of an artist, and all of a sudden you'll be seeing all these political posts. And this is very crucial because we found that anonymously managed pages, groups, and channels on social media have become a hub for disinformation because number one, of course, there's anonymity, and of course, there's deniability. Let's say for the names of the ones that I mentioned earlier, the support pages, they are not really directed, they're not really linked to the candidate's name. So even if they push any other content, false content against whoever, they can deny that they have no say, they have no control over that. And also, comment section have been used for black propaganda because the thing is, even if it's a totally unrelated post, it's an entertainment post, some keyboard warriors would suddenly swarm that area or would swarm that comment section and would post all the false content. So in short, you won't be anywhere you look, you'll be filled with that, especially as the elections would go near. And we are expecting somehow the same thing in 2022 because the pandemic has forced everyone to just practically stay home and use the internet as a primary source of information. And we found out that these support pages are linked to networks, disinformation networks, which promote spammy behavior and inauthentic behavior. I'll just describe it later because I did an investigative report on this. It's called Twin Mark. So basically, it's part of it's a disinformation network that's part of promoting propaganda of the government, not just propaganda, but also fake information. And Facebook found it and they took it down. But the problem is, once you take it down, it's just like it's a game of cat and mouse. There's really no end to that. Now moving forward to the 2022 Philippine elections. Of course, the challenges, number one, it's still for the government side, for the COMELEC side, it's still campaign financing. Although there is a good development now on the part of Facebook. They created this, I forgot the exact name, but it's a public database of the ads on their platform. Like they are requiring everyone who buys political ads to put their name, to say which candidate is it for and all that. But the thing is, ultimately, that will help COMELEC. But the main problem still is disinformation. As I said earlier, with the current information ecosystem and the current information landscape, wherein we have fewer and fewer independent sources of information, and then we are inundated by propaganda and fake news, it's getting harder and harder as the elections near to find independent and reliable information. This is the one I was talking about earlier. It's called Twin Mark. What happened was Twin Mark is a media company, and Twin Mark has has many website assets. So as I said earlier, they have like the names of the website. They look fake when you look at it, but then sometimes they just change Philippine and then they change one spelling, so that when you look at it, it looks fake, but it won't look fake, I mean, and then you will still share it. But the point is, Twin Mark, the websites of Twin Mark are being shared by influencers including and government officials, including Mocha Uson and other propaganda bloggers. So we have found this investigative report that I did with the former colleague. We found direct links between this company and the celebrities and influencers that were paid to post Duterte propaganda and even false content against critics and perceived enemies. But to emphasize again, when we say disinformation network, it's not necessarily all the accounts in that network would post false content. Sometimes their goal is to lure people in that content, so it grows bigger and bigger. So this is where the entertainment accounts, the viral accounts come in, so that when people access them, and some people who don't know anything about that page, they just found it funny, they would like it, and then they're already part of that circle, and then they would then be susceptible to the information and false content that will be put out. So for the 2022, while we are focused on Facebook because we are still a Facebook country, YouTube has surpassed Facebook in the last quarter of 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And so those are the top two social media platforms. But also one of the challenges now, it's misinformation being spread on closed apps like Messenger, because Messenger and WhatsApp and Viber and all those kinds of messaging services, you cannot really monitor them. I know WhatsApp and Facebook already imposed a limit to the number of times you can forward any kind of messages, but I tried it, I think, a few weeks ago with a friend, and it's still not implemented properly. We could still send it around in one sitting, in one press, we can just send it 20 times. And also, I think one thing that we should be watching out for in the 2022 elections is TikTok. While we are focused heavily on Facebook, TikTok is really, because TikTok users are below 34 years old, and the bulk of voters now is 18 to 40 years old. And many of the TikTok users, influencers, I have noticed, they are being used. We could not find a direct link, but we could see that the micro influencers, when I say micro influencers, these are not the celebrities, but they have enough sticky followers to be effective in their area. So what they do is they post misinformation, they post false content. And TikTok so far is not really open to their algorithm or something. And although TikTok has a fact-checking initiative with Agence France-Presse, many false videos still thrive on TikTok. And another problem is the cross-posting of TikTok videos on Facebook. So these are the things we should watch out for in the 2022 elections.
Thank you, Camille.
Thank you.
We will open it to Q&A in a moment. I'd ask if you're going to ask a question of the panel, please identify yourself in the Q&A function, and I'll go ahead and read it out. To start, though, I'd like to ask a question of each of our panelists. So, Camille, if I could pick up on your presentation. After the 2016 elections, Rappler, I think Verifiles, and AFP were all selected by Facebook to help with this fact-checking campaign, which we've seen Facebook try to do globally. Do you see any evidence that that was particularly effective? And headed into the next election, is focusing on that kind of fact-checking kind of fighting the last war? Because as you pointed out, so much of this has now moved to things like Messenger and WhatsApp and Viber, where you can't jump in and fact check everything that your uncle says to his 100 friends that he sends these things out to.
Yeah, I think to a certain extent, fact checking is helpful, but it's not really sustainable, because the moment you fact check a false claim, it has already spread to how many people you don't even know. It's like running after something that's, I think for me, it's kind of useless. Like if I oversimplify it, because it's not really sustainable, and it's like running after some crumbs. Yeah, so while in a way, yeah, I think for me, fact checking now, it raises awareness about disinformation, but addressing the root cause, it's not effective in that sense.
Thanks. So Aries, connecting these two presentations, I find it odd to think that the Duterte campaign in particular, but I mean, others have now picked up on this, have shown this ability to reach a nationwide audience on social media. And yet what we've seen in nationwide results, particularly in the midterms in 2019, is cartelization, as you said. I remember watching Ronald Mendoza give a remarks after 2019 midterms about how the Philippine House and Senate are now more packed with dynasties than they have been at any point in the last 30 years. So if social media campaigns have broken open this ability to message to the masses, why is it only existing celebrities and political dynasties who seem to be winning elections again?
Well, if you have dynasties who have really dominated and perfected electoral politics, and you have this new technology and social media, it's an instant adoption of the technology. Given that they have the resources, they could easily mobilize and include social media as part of what we call in Philippine political science as the political machine of any politician or candidate. However, there's also this idea, particularly because social media is a bit bizarre and strange to the older generation of politicians, right? So there are politicians who think that whatever it is in social media, that if they're getting good coverage, is that it will translate to votes. All political science studies have so far made the argument, and has proven this with experiments as well as other research methodologies, that the keyboard doesn't necessarily translate to the ballot box. That the noise in social media might just rally the base, and it might just confuse some people, but at the end, the logic of substitution also comes into play. Meaning, if I'm very active politically online, that substitutes my on the ground and offline political participation. However, we do observe, and I think the pandemic and the way that the Duterte administration has mishandled the pandemic, I'm calling it as it is, thus far, and the pandemic is almost 2 years running, has mobilized a lot of Filipinos, particularly the young. I've seen it myself, to register, to reactivate, and COMELEC, the Commission on Elections, was actually surprised, and the number of expected registered new voters as well as reactivated voters surpassed their calculation. So this means that you will have a bigger Filipino voting electorate come May 2022, but that also opens a lot of other possibilities, including, of course, another notorious practice in electoral politics, which is vote buying.
Thanks, Aries. All right, let's turn to the audience. And I want to start with a question from Amanda Nepomuceno, who kind of addresses the second part of our title here, the alliance. So how would you view the Philippines' future engagement with China, the U.S., and the international community following the election? Do you think it's important for Philippine presidential aspirants to articulate a global strategic direction to the electorate as a public policy exercise? And I'd welcome thoughts from either of you, but Aries, we already have you unmuted, so maybe I can turn to you first.
Sorry. Okay, the foreign policy issues have never really, in Philippine electoral history, have never figured in the campaign. In 2016, the nearest to any foreign policy debate or pronouncement was the jet ski remark that Duterte will ride a jet ski and plant the Filipino flag if the Chinese comes and invade some of the other claimed island in the Spratlys. However, I think a lot of Filipinos are learning that the silence of presidential candidates in the campaign doesn't mean that they will not throw the baby in the bathwater when they become president, as we have seen with what President Duterte has done to the country's foreign policy. If you ask me, President Duterte has undone decades of stable, consistent, and predictable Philippine foreign and security policy. And to the extent that it has caused massive damage, while the intentions seem to be, I'm being gracious here, good in terms of finding new partners and putting the Philippines first and in its independent foreign policy notion, the implementation was so bad and was so messy. And just to prove that even the road to hell is paved with good intention. So moving forward, I think there are some Filipinos, I will not say a majority, but more Filipinos, I think, will ask about foreign policy issues, particularly if candidates are able to make the connection that foreign policy issues with the U.S., with the alliance, or perhaps more obviously, the country's China policy could be a gut or a kitchen table issue. The moment that the candidates are able to do this, then Filipino voters will be able to perhaps have foreign policy decisions as an influencer or a determinant in their voting choice.
Thanks. Camille?
Yeah, I agree with what Dr. Aries said, that not many Filipinos would really base their voting preference on the foreign policy stance of many candidates. However, I'd like to point out, I feel like the South China Sea issue is becoming a really, really critical issue for Filipino voters. I'll just connect this to what happened. Remember the pandemic when there was a video between the Philippine state media and also Chinese state media about the supposed cooperation, and there was the title, I think, was Iisang Dagat, so it's one sea, shared sea, and China really faced strong backlash from social media users then. So I feel like because recently for the past years, there have been numerous stories, media stories, and actual direct stories from the ground about how Filipino fishermen have been affected by Chinese aggression. So it has become somehow closer to the public. But like in terms of like foreign policies, foreign relations, not so much, because the priorities of Filipinos now are jobs, food, livelihood. Yeah.
Thanks. Let's go to a question from Camille Bismonte, previously with the Southeast Asia Program here at CSIS. Given that the presidential and vice presidential candidates are elected separately, and that generally the VP is the opposition to the winning president, how likely do we think that Bongbong and Sara Duterte can both be elected together? Aries, you're now a fellow with a polling firm. I think, are you contractually obligated to answer questions about polling now?
I'll give it a shot. You are correct, Camille. Throughout the history until by the end of the dictatorship in 1986, there was only one time wherein candidates from the same ticket won the presidency and the vice presidency, and that was in 2004 with Arroyo and De Castro winning together. However, that election, there's a cloud of doubt with the actual final results of that election. But be that as it may, the idea here is that what we are seeing is, as far as current polling and the latest social weather stations polling has put Marcos Jr. at an astounding 47% of all respondents. However, previous polling put him around the early to mid 20s, but with Sara Duterte trailing in second with almost the same number. So if you approximate those two numbers, two early 20 numbers, that's the 47%. So you can make the inference that will likely Sarah's numbers has contributed to Bongbong Marcos's numbers. And in the latest same SWS survey that was commissioned by Stratbase, Sara Duterte's as vice president is also at second place with 24%. So we're still not in the official campaign season. The numbers can still change, particularly in the presidential race, because Bongo's name was not included in that particular survey. But if there is something that is a team in which both members of the ticket has a fighting chance of winning together, my bet would be the Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte alliance, simply because their political bailiwicks, the Marcos vote representing the North and Sara Duterte representing Mindanao, the solid South, are complementary rather than competitive. So this means that their voters are not gonna cannibalize one another. The threat is actually the ability of Sara Duterte to be able to deliver votes for Marcos Jr. given Bongo's entrance. So it was actually, that was the wrench in this dynasty cartel idea. It would have been a solid cartel if President Duterte has not pushed or nudged Bongo to run for the presidency. However, there are analysts who are saying that there is another card that President Duterte, I have to say President Duterte because there are now two Dutertes at play. And this is the disqualification case against Marcos Jr. Given that President Duterte has packed the Supreme Court with his appointees, if the complaint leads there, I will bet that President Duterte will use, he's been wielding power all throughout his entire term. He will not think twice of doing that so long as he's still president.
Thanks, Aries. Camille, let me give you the next question from Greg Rushford. He's curious to know whether China is running disinformation campaigns in the Philippines.
There was a network that was taken down by Facebook mid-2020, if I remember it correctly. It's linked to Fujian province, and this is the same disinformation network that has been interfering and that was interfering in the Taiwan elections and also during the peak of the Hong Kong protests. And what they did in the Philippines, Facebook found out that they were posting, they created accounts, Facebook accounts, pages, and also groups promoting Sara Duterte and Bongbong Marcos's sister, Amy Marcos. And I'd like to connect it to the previous question because the question was, do we think the two will win? But I'd like to point out, I think it's worthy to point out that those two candidates also have the biggest, those two are the biggest recipients of disinformation networks or disinformation efforts. They are the biggest beneficiaries. So let's see if it will help the votes. But yeah, to go back to the second question about China, what they're doing right now, we are still looking at if they're going to expand those disinformation networks. But so far, we're seeing continuous strengthening of media ties between Chinese state media and Philippine state media, and also several private media here in the Philippines. So we're watching it out. We're watching out for it.
Thanks. Let's go to Satro Bagasantoso, who says, Satro is an alumni of Ateneo de Davao. His question is addressed to both panelists. The relationship between the Philippines and the United States has faced some challenges during the Duterte administration. What is the main homework for the next administration? How can the Philippines balance its relationship with the US and China? Any thoughts?
I was just reading the report from the latest meeting of the bilateral security dialogue, and I think that summed up the to-do list of the U.S. Philippine alliance. I think it was a good development. There was some really nice points there to be made. The agenda seems to be tight, and it concerns the pandemic. It concerns hard security issues. It concerns climate change. It concerns about science and technology. And this means that the U.S.-Philippine alliance simply does not revolve around traditional security cooperation. This is good, and this gives, I think, some room for the eventual winner of the 2022 elections for a reboot. Particularly, given that no one in the presidential contenders have the surname of Duterte. And even if Sara Duterte wins as vice president, we've seen that, as I've said, Sara Duterte can potentially still support the reboot. So I think the agenda is quite clear. And I think credit goes to the bureaucracies of both countries, as well as the Track 2 people that have been pushing for the strengthening of this alliance, because candidates don't even need to think what to do. The agenda is clear. The things that are needed to be done has been laid out. It's just a matter of whether or not the winner of the 2022 elections will simply just rely on this solidly backed up agenda, or will just again path his own way or her own way and simply uh, put a monkey wrench on things simply because he or she was not involved in that process. I am not saying that won't happen, because that has happened before. The changes in Malacanang means changes in policy. But I do think there's also a lot of learning and rationality from how the Duterte administration has behaved as far as US policy. And this will give the presidential contenders a chance to redeem Philippine-US policy.
Thanks, Aries. Camille, Eric Lachica with U.S. Filipinos for Good Governance here in D.C. asked, what steps should Democratic opposition leaders and good governance activists take to minimize disinformation and malicious attacks online? How do you effectively complain to Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, etc.?
I am of the belief that ultimately, while we can do so many things as part of civil society, it will be lopsided. It will still be in favor of platforms. So the platforms really have to do something about this. And we are not sure if these American tech companies will exert the same effort as they did in the 2020 US elections, because of course the Philippines were part of the global South. But I think especially for those in the US, like your group, you can call out Facebook, like maybe, I don't know if it will be effective to them, because many to write to them, because so far they are the subjects of congressional investigations, and all the good PR somehow they will need. So it won't hurt to try it. But basically, unfortunately, like I am of the belief that ultimately the platforms really have to do something about this. We can't do this all alone, because we have been, like, for example, civil society has been doing so many things to educate the public, to raise awareness, not just in the Philippines, but also globally. But ultimately, we are acting in the universe of these platforms. We're at their mercy.
Thanks. Aries, Paul Sarno asked about Leni Robredo. What is her support? What are her negatives? And I guess we haven't really talked about the fact that Leni's made some gains, although she's way back from 47% in the new survey.
Right. In that survey that was commissioned by Stratbase to social weather stations, Leni Robredo has placed second to Bongbong Marcos with 18%. And but that has been, if you're familiar with her vice presidential bid, we're seeing the same pattern, and I do think, given that it's likely the same people behind the Robredo campaign, that they know that the path to their success in 2016 is being slow and steady, not going out in the bang and then losing steam in the middle of the campaign. We started to notice that in some of the campaigns already, and it's not yet even the official campaign season, that some candidates are losing momentum. However, Leni Robredo's pros and cons, well, she's the sitting vice president. It can't get any nearer than that. And second, I think she has carved herself as the genuine anti-Duterte candidate. Other candidates have claimed to be such, but their actions as well as their rhetoric are so far from being anti-Duterte. And I think what Leni Robredo offers is some form of the idea that if some do not really like the changes that has happened under the Duterte administration, then Leni Robredo provides that comfort, or that idea that Philippine politics could be normalized post Duterte 2022.
Thanks, Aries. Camille, we have a question from Henry Howard to you. Would you not consider ABS-CBN a dynasty owned and controlled by the Lopez family that has picked winners and losers in elections? And I think this is a reference to your mention of the attacks on ABS-CBN under the Duterte government, which, according to the Duterte government, started nominally because of ABS-CBN's refusal to air Duterte ads in 2016.
Mm-hmm. I think yes. I mean, they are a big conglomerate, but I wouldn't say it's dynasty in the sense of business, but ultimately they don't have the say on government power. At the like, look at what happened to them, right? After being attacked by the president, they're at their mercy. But definitely, ABS-CBN is a kingmaker. I don't know if Aris will agree with that, but in the past, really, it's a kingmaker. Like almost all of its shows, you would see politicians scrambling to get a spot to air their ads, to even have a spot to be interviewed by any of their artists. So yes, in that way, but also I think it's also applicable to other businessmen, that they have pet candidates that they would like, whatever fits their business, whatever will work for their businesses. So in a way, yes.
Greg, can I chip in real quick? This ABS-CBN issue is being framed by the Duterte administration as a war on oligarchs. I can distinctly remember Duterte's first State of the Union, State of the Nation address is that he's waging a war against the oligarchy, which surprised me because no other president have I heard a president mentioning that he is against the oligarchy, because we've had oligarchic presidents before. However, as we have seen in other countries like Venezuela, in Russia, populist presidents who wage wars against oligarchs create their own oligarchs as well. So what is happening in ABS-CBN, to some extent, you might say that good, because that will stem the power of oligarchs, but you empower the oligarchs that you are also creating. So this selective persecution, I think, is something that needs to be thought of. And that when a government shuts down a media company without due recourse is an attack on the freedom of the press, and is a basic indicator of democratic erosion.
Thanks, Aries.
Also, just one point. And also, I think we have to look at it not just as one lens of ABS-CBN. We also have to look at what I kept on saying earlier, that the whole media landscape context, it's not just ABS-CBN that's being attacked by the president. It's also Rappler, it's also Inquirer. So you'll see that it's not just a problem with ABS. It's more of like the pattern of this government attacking free press.
Thanks. Andrea, an IR student, asks if Sara Duterte were to win the VP seat, would she have significant influence over Philippine politics? Which, Aries, we haven't really talked about. How much power does the vice president actually wield, if any?
For me, it was quite weird. There was a day, I think it was last Saturday, where in the news was that both Sara Duterte and the father were going to run for vice president, right? So that weekend was really mind-boggling and bizarre for every one of us who have been monitoring Philippine politics. But it also makes you realize, why is there so much fuzz about the vice presidency when, if you look at the formal powers, the vice presidency has one power, and that is constitutional succession. There's no other power unless that power is given by the president. So, however, it might be different, and this is where, to what extent this alliance between Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte becomes ironclad, and whether they will both win. In some of the news, we've heard that the idea of term sharing, that power, that the presidency and actual leadership over the country, if they both win, will actually be shared. And a lot of people said that this is a mockery of democratic politics, but we see this in a lot of democracies. Presidents and vice presidents work together. We've seen this in the U.S., but because we elected them separately, and normally they come from different tickets, such kind of collective leadership is not seen. And this is why I think it's quite troubling, and there's too much concentration of power, because a vice president coming from another ticket somehow informally acts as a check on the president. But if Sara Duterte wins and Marcos Jr. wins, the vice president doesn't become a fiscalizer, unlike before, and a possible threat to the presidency. The vice president becomes a partner, and in this case, I would even argue, with this type of cartel, an equal partner.
Thanks, Aries. So we have 5 minutes left. Let me give one last question to each of you, and if you want to use it as a jumping off point for any closing thoughts, that would be great. So for Camille, we have Deepak Nair from the National University of Singapore, who said, could you share more details about the infrastructure and people behind disinformation campaigns? Who are they? Are they coming from troll farms in the Philippines or overseas? Are they hired or dedicated supporters, and who funds them? And then for Aries, Julie McCarthy from NPR in the Philippines said, you talked about the dynasty cartel and the complicity thereof. What are they conspiring to do if they are complicit? You said such cartelization will speed the end of Philippine liberal democracy. How will they do that? What happens as a result of their complicity? Camille, do you want to start us off?
Sure. To answer Deepak's question, it's both local and overseas overseas troll farms and similar kinds. We won't necessarily call it troll farms because they have somehow evolved. They have professionalized their rank, so to speak. So like now, if you will see on LinkedIn and many, like even on Facebook, you would see a lot of job openings for social media posts, and we are seeing a trend that it usually peaks during elections. And we are also seeing now that we are talking about troll farms in the Philippines, but some of those troll farms are not necessarily addressing the Philippine market. Some of them are hired abroad because that's how the business works. But also at the other end of it, we are also seeing, like what I said earlier, with the takedown of China-linked disinformation network, we are seeing foreign troll farms and foreign groups try to influence social media or the information ecosystem here. So it's both ways. And also for specifically, I can talk about Twinmark, that big network, that big digital media network that was taken down by Facebook. So what they usually do is they actually hire writers, social media producers, and basically just posters. So they have different ranks. So some of the writers are actually college graduates from decent schools, from even the top schools in the country. And then for the social media posts, these are high school graduates. So they have that. They actually are composed of, I think their staff members are around 100. So they're really a big network. And what happened was when they were taken down by Facebook, they were able to, like after a month, they were able to go back to the platform because that's how big their businesses are. They have, I'm not kidding, they have almost 1,000 websites and Facebook assets, and they have people to monitor that. So anytime one part of it goes down, they can immediately go up and go back to the platform.
Thanks, Emil. Aries?
Right. The idea here is that a dynasty cartel will not simply be a coalition of convenience to win 2022. A dynasty cartel means that this collusion will continue. And we're talking about, as I've said, second generation dynast. And they would simply not be satisfied with ruling for 6 years. The cartelization of these dynasties means that somehow they figured out a way that, hey, why can't we just share power, limit competition, and make sure that the next winners of the presidential and national elections comes from us? That there would be no mavericks like a Duterte coming in because power is concentrated within the dynasties. So that, I think, if these dynasties are really rational and thinking long term, that could be a way. They're all ambitious. They're all greedy. They all want power. But if they could have longer time horizons, then they're not just scrambling to win the next electoral cycle. And therefore, the oligarchy in the Philippines ceased to be wild, but more driven by rules and honor, even if it's honor among thieves. But the idea that this cartel is emerging should also signal to the opposition that they should also not coalesce just for 2022, that they should be thinking that the idea here is to build institutions, to build a strong party in order to, so that Philippine democracy could be safeguarded.
Thank you, Aries. All right, it is 9:59. in DC, 10:59 p.m. for Camille and Aries. So we are honor bound to let them go. Thank you so much for your time, both of you. Thank all of you for joining in. It's just getting started. We've got 6 more months of Philippine campaigning, and then it's a brave new world. So thank you all very much and have a wonderful day or evening.